in Washington State in Olympia at Evergreen College there, and there were a lot of workshops, and people were crossing the campus going from workshop to workshop, and some of us were going to another one. And some people came by and they said, those primitivists are even crazier than we thought. There was a guy in there who said he thought the earth is flat. And we looked at each other and we said, Ben, our friend. But actually, apparently, kind of reconstructing that, he was talking about banned society. He was talking about a totally decentralized world, a really anti-globalization world, and with reference to people whose society, whose world is maybe 60 or 80 people. Picture that, face-to-face society instead of mass society. Then he was discussing that a little bit, and he said for them, it doesn't matter if it's round or flat. What perspective is that? And linking it to the idea that you have to have an industrialized world to get that ship up there to take that picture. It's not just a nice picture on a poster. It involves the whole thing, the whole reality that we're suffering under, and that we're supposed to ignore in terms of its basis and its drive forward, and what it is. What is it that drives it forward? All these questions. And I think that has to do with the other line there that I had. It's about a world that doesn't need running. What kind of a world would that be? It wouldn't be a globalized world. And when we get maybe back down to earth a little bit, and we think about what are we doing as anarchists? What do we represent in terms of the chances for changing things, and how much do we want to change? You get to that. You get to these basic questions and very specific ones as well. For example, we could ask, what happened to the anti-globalization movement? I mean, a lot of things slowed down after 9/11 and so forth. We could go back and forth about that, but I think one thing that you can point out, and maybe I'm wrong here, but one of the problems with the anti-globalization movement, if we want to call it that, if that's largely what it was, in terms of all Seattle and Genoa and so forth, in the early part of this decade, is that it wasn't anti-globalization. It was never anti-globalization, almost not at all. There were just a few people who were. What I mean is, at these big demos, very commonly, some journalists would come up and stick the microphone in the nearest protester's face and say, "Why are you against globalization?" And want something for the evening news or whatever. And they'd say, "We're not against globalization. We're against corporate globalization. We want the nice, bottom-up, warm and fuzzy globalization." Oh, okay. Well, that's one answer. Except, how does that work? It's still globalization. It's still a matter of, in the U.S. anywhere, where the food travels an average of over 2,000 kilometers from where it's grown to where it's consumed, and that distance is growing. And what do you have to do to make that happen, for example? And that's a positive thing, generally speaking. Everybody would like to have some grapes from southern Chile in February or something. Of course, why not? Well, what's the cost of that? What does that mean? What does it mean to the people that are producing it? What does any part of it mean? What does it mean now that China is in hyperdrive with globalization, and you get million-ton plumes of pollution that are falling now in Western North America? You got thousands of coal miners that give it up every year to feed the machine, to feed industrialization. You've got to have that. You don't have the technology without the industrialization. You can't see across the street in some eastern cities in China. The rivers are poisoned. We know all this. And India, by the way, is right on their heels. And everybody, that's just the name of the game. I was in Turkey a month or two ago, and I heard this guy saying, we've got a lot of catching up to do, in terms of development. Well, in the suicide derby, you do have a lot of catching up to do. You can catch up to the point where then you'll have a society where kids go to school and kill each other, like in the U.S. And of course there are great cultural differences. This is not This is not a gun-mad country up here compared to the US, but there's no real reason to think that's not going to come, insofar as the modernity mass society keeps on rolling, and you get more and more industry and technology. It's just cancer that spreads. What would stop that? First of all, problematizing it, saying it's not just automatic or inevitable or like the sun coming out. It only is if people accept it that way. Well, anyway, this one, as I said, I think is about 23 or 24 minutes. It's much more straightforward, and it covers some of the angles of the contemporary questions like peak oil and so forth, but from an anti-civ spin, very definitely. I don't want to talk about this too much. I'd rather kind of move on to discussion. But I would like to say that I think this film is pretty good, but I also feel it's kind of anti-civ light. I mean, it glosses over a whole lot, and you know, in 24 minutes, that's the way that goes, I guess. But you know, I think there were parts of it that need to be paid more attention to. For example, when Jared Diamond and many others observe how civilizations collapse, and the whole point about domestication being the worst mistake that the species ever made, you know, it really is about institutions. It's much easier to say, sort of vaguely, well, we have to change our values and this and that, and you know, that to me, unfortunately, that slides too easily into greenwashing. We want to be green, we want to be sustainable, and we're cool, and we recycle, and the whole thing kind of just slips away. It really doesn't work that way. And you know, what surprises me also to some degree is that people on the left, who you would think to look to for a discussion of social institutions, are the ones that are avoiding that. For example, the most fundamental one is division of labor, is specialization. And that pushes the whole thing forward from the very beginning to right now. Ask any economist. What drives the world system forward, the economy? It's ever more division of labor. And if that's just ignored and pretend it's just an invisible thing and you've got nothing to do with that, it's parallel with the other one. And I think division of labor gets to a certain point, where it did in the story of the species and the havoc that's been wrought, it gets to the point of domestication. I think that's the only plausible explanation, or maybe it's just a guess. It sets the stage for that place at which, pretty much simultaneously and not that long ago, that great mistake was made. That shift to control, that shift to domination, that shift away from accepting what nature gives, what the earth gives. And then everything changes. Everything changes. Civilization comes in right after that, and the whole thing goes crazy. Civilization is chronic war. I mean, all the things that we know. You have to go back and look at those institutions. You can we can talk about the psychological denial that's so immense, and that's what we're talking about too. But it really is a matter of these institutions and that's the sticky thing. That's why Richard Heinberg and so many other people would rather just imagine a nice collapse. Or not so nice, but nice in the sense that the agency question is taken care of. It's going to fail. It's going to crash. It's going to fall. And that gets back to the question of the die-off. As Chomsky and other people claim, that people that want a primitive future as the only possible future are talking about the die-off of billions of people. Well, you know, I've seen those tower blocks in Sao Paulo or Istanbul, and all those people, they don't even have a tiny garden. They're going to be dead in 3 or 4 days if it falls. And so it could be an error, it could be a failure, a kind of ethical failure, an intellectual failure, and I think it is, to say, well, collapse is coming. And Heinberg in particular, and I've talked to him about this, you can have this illusion that it will fall. Well, how about making it fall? Or in other words, how about stepping in there and getting to work?